All right, so we are going to talk first about plants and how they move to land and the key characteristics that they have, and then later we'll talk about fungi and how fungi made it onto land. We're talking about them at the same time though because they're very interrelated. Plants really couldn't have been able to colonize land without fungi, okay? So they're kind of the unsung heroes of life on land. So when we talk about plants, true plants, we call them embryophytes, okay? So if it is a true plant within what we call kingdom Plantae, it's kind of more technical term as an embryophyte. And phyte just means plant. Embryo means embryo, right? And so embryophytes right here are so named because they produce multicellular embryos which are supported by the parent's plant's tissue, right? So here's kind of, I guess you can think of this kind of like the placenta transferring nutrients to this embryo right here, right? But land plants, embryophytes, their closest living relative, we think, their sister taxa would be charophyte algae or some sort of charophyte green algae, right? Because they share a lot of common characteristics with these charophytes, and the charophytes still exist today, so it's, easy to study them, you think? But we think that at some point we diverge. One group of charophytes diverged, ended up on land, living in more of a terrestrial environment, and then has evolved into what we call embryophytes now, land plants. Okay, so that term embryophytes means true land plants. But some have kind of evolved to also live in the water, but that's a different story. Okay, so this chapter is pretty heavy in vocab. Let's kind of address some of that kind of off the top. So when we use the suffix phyte, that just means plant. Okay, angia or angium, angia singular, angium multiple, plural. That just means a type of tissue, right? So tissue being multiple types of cells working together. And when we talk about the stages of a plant's life cycle, which we'll have a whole other video talking about some of the stages of a plant's life cycle, we use the terms gametophyte and sporophyte. And each stage is named for what it produces. So the gametophyte stage produces the gametes, sperm and egg cells. The sporophyte stage produces these spores, which are a haploid cell that goes on to produce the gametophyte stage. Okay, so plants go through unique alternation of generations, which we'll talk about, but that's the idea here. And some of the vocab terms, plants often turn a lot of people off. They turn me off when I first learn them because the vocab is so wonky. So hopefully this helps to kind of clear it up right off the top. Okay, so early plants, again, we think their sister group is that charophyte algae. This is an example of one that is still around today. And the reason why we think that they share a common ancestor with the charophytes is because they have similar structures for synthesizing cellulose. So cellulose is that starch that's in the plant cell walls, right? And both charophytes and land plants, embryophytes, share kind of like a rosette protein structure shape that builds cellulose. Okay, and we only find those in those two lineages. Other organisms that produce cellulose have a different shaped protein structure to do that. And both charophytes and land plants use a molecule called sporopollenin to protect either their spores or their zygotes. So sporopollenin will often, plants that reproduce using pollen, find it coating the pollen grains. Okay? Or in plants that reproduce using spores, we'll find it coating those spores. Okay? And that's actually one way that we can identify different species of plants, is they all have a unique sporopollenin coat to their pollen. Okay? But this is a molecule that its main function is to prevent desiccation, to prevent drying out of the spores. But we find it both in the charophytes and in the land plants today. Okay? Because we think that these charophytes would have lived kind of on the edge of a lot of these watery areas, and so they could have potentially dried out. Okay, so there's that risk of the water receding and drying out, and so that sporopollenin provides a protective coat around their embryos or their zygotes in order to protect them from drying out. Side note, zygote just means a fertilized egg, basically a single-celled embryo. Okay, so unique characteristics of embryophytes. So all land plants go through this process of what we call alternation of generations. We think that this life cycle process evolved multiple times independently in different lineages of algae, but we do think it evolved independently in embryophytes as well, those true land plants. So basically what's going on here, quick overview, I'll link to some more in-depth videos, but basically what's going on is that plants have two distinct life cycle stages. They have what we call their gametophyte stage, which is haploid. It contains one copy of each chromosome. And they have another life cycle stage, which is what we call their sporophyte stage. Their sporophyte stage is diploid. They have two copies of each chromosome. And they'll spend part of their life in the gametophyte stage and part of their life in the sporophyte stage. So, quick rundown. Let's start right here with a single-celled haploid spore. Okay, so this is just a single cell. It kind of floats off, maybe it gets caught in a stream of water, and then it lands somewhere, hopefully nice and comfy with lots of nutrients around. This single-celled spore, haploid spore, is going to go through mitosis, making exact copies of itself to produce a multicellular structure that we call the gametophyte. Okay? In some plants, the gametophyte is a free-living stage all on its own. That gametophyte stage, multicellular, will produce gametes, sperm and egg, through the process of mitosis. So these haploid cells go through mitosis to produce sperm and egg. Hopefully a gamete from another plant comes in, fertilizes the gamete that's in this gametophyte right here, okay? Haploid cell plus haploid cell gets us back to a diploid cell. So after fertilization, we are now in a diploid stage. And what happens in some plants, especially these early plants I'll be talking about, is that now this diploid stage kind of grows up and out of this haploid gametophyte stage. So it basically stays connected to that gametophyte. So it'll grow up and out of that gametophyte. And that diploid stage is what we call the sporophyte stage. Okay, so sporophyte stage, two copies of each chromosome, is diploid. This sporophyte stage is named a sporophyte because it produces spores. Okay, so it will go through meiosis. Specialized cells within the sporophyte stage will go through meiosis, taking it from diploid to haploid. Remember, increasing genetic variation in meiosis. So diploid to haploid through meiosis to produce those haploid spores. Single cells just get sent off into the world all alone to hopefully start the whole thing over again. That was just like, whoa, what just happened there? Totally fine. It's okay. I was like that for a long time when I started learning about plants too, but we'll post another video that walks through it a little bit more in depth. But this is something that's unique to land plants that we think was an adaptation to help them survive on land and spread their gametes around on land. Alright, more unique characteristics of embryophytes. So those spores that we just talked about, they are protected in a coat of sporopollenin. Remember that molecule that we just talked about that was unique to charophytes and plants? Right? So the spores that are produced are coated in that special molecule that helps them prevent desiccation, and we call it sporopollenin. And those spores are produced in a specialized tissue within the sporophyte. So this is a moss. This entire thing right here is what we call the sporophyte life cycle stage. Okay, so this is all diploid stage right here. And in moss, all of this down here is the haploid gametophyte stage. Okay, so diploid stage, specialized cells in that sporophyte stage, called the sporangium, which are contained inside of here in this capsule, produce these haploid spores that are coated in sporopollenin. Okay. Oof, so much vocab in this one. Plants, land plants, embryophytes, true land plants, also grow in very specific locations on their body. Okay, so we will get into kind of the anatomy and physiology of plants later, I think in 212 or 213. But when plants grow, they don't just grow at any random spot in their body. They grow in specific locations we call apical meristems. at both their shoots and their roots. So they have an apical meristem at their shoot, where it's just basically a concentration of kind of like stem cells, I guess you could say, cells that haven't differentiated, that just continue to divide and divide and divide to provide more cells. That way the plant can grow upwards. Okay. And then we see the same thing at the roots. We see some apical meristem cells at the roots that continue to grow and divide, so that way the roots can continue to grow and move out into the ground. If the plant has roots, not all plants have roots. Okay, so big idea here is just that growth is concentrated in these apical meristem regions. Okay, at least what we call primary growth, increase in height and increase in the depth of the roots. All right, some of the characteristics that help plants live on land. Cuticle and stomata. Okay, so most but not all land plants have a waxy layer that surrounds them called a cuticle. Okay, and this cuticle is there in order to prevent water loss, right? We said that loss of water is a huge challenge to living on land. Okay, plants need water to photosynthesize. So most plants have adaptations to retain as much water as possible. Okay, so that's kind of what I'm trying to show here, is that this water beads up on this kale leaf. That's its cuticle right there, where the water is beating up. Let me grab, maybe this helps. So this is my office plant. It doesn't have a name yet, so you can think of any names. I would appreciate some suggestions, but you can kind of see, I don't know if this is working, but you can kind of see how it's kind of shiny, right? And it's waxy. I'm feeling it's kind of waxy. It's because it has a cuticle to prevent water loss on it. Okay, so let my little golden pothos office plant help me name it. Okay, so that's the cuticle. The other thing that plants have, now because they have that waxy, basically waterproof layer, it's also impermeable to gases. So plants still need to exchange gases, right? They need to bring in carbon dioxide so that way they can photosynthesize, and then they need to get rid of oxygen so that way their enzymes in the plant cells that carry out photosynthesis, they get confused by oxygen. Oxygen gets them all wonky. So stomata are basically openings. Stomata are basically openings in that cuticle. Stoma means mouth, right? But they're openings in that cuticle that allow the plant to open and close that opening so that way they can exchange gases. Okay, so these are other characteristics of embryophytes that help them live on land. Not all plants have cuticles or stomata though, but many do. Okay, so what were early plants like? What was this like? Okay, so remember at this point in time, there are no animals on land. There's maybe some microorganisms and fungi around, and that's it, right? So all of the plants that we think about that use bees or butterflies or birds to pollinate, that was not an option for these early plants. They had to figure it out on their own. There also wouldn't have been really deep, rich soil, right? Soil in many ways is very much a living organism, and it's produced by living organisms. So it would have been maybe sandy and rocky. Okay, so there's not a lot of really deep soil for plants to grab onto. So early plants like this one right here, Cooksonia, did not have roots. They didn't stand very tall. This whole structure right here, right? So here's a scale bar, 2 millimeters. Okay, so this looks like it's maybe like 10 inches tall. No, this is maybe 10 millimeters tall. Okay, so they didn't really have true leaves yet. We really just see kind of these green stems, and then these structures up here would have been their sporangia, where they produce their spores. Right? So no roots, no leaves, just kind of green stems where they can photosynthesize, and they're very small because they didn't have any vascular tissue at this point in time. So vascular tissue is basically what helps plants stand upright, gives them that structural support to maintain their uprightness to fight against gravity. That did not exist in early plants. Okay, so not a lot going on, but in the game of evolution, as long as you can survive, you don't need to be super complex, right? But the unsung hero here of plants colonizing land are fungi. So when you're algae living in the water. Nutrients are just moving in the water. You can just absorb them directly from the water moving over you. Totally different game when you're on land. When you're on land, you gotta have specialized structures to extract those nutrients from the environment, from that soil, right? Early land plants didn't have roots. They had some kind of like holdfasts to kind of keep them secured on the ground so they didn't blow away, but that's it. They didn't absorb anything from the land, from the soil. It wasn't really soil then. But fungi were around. Fungi are really good at breaking down inorganic material, and they started to create a symbiotic relationship with plant cells. So plants really wouldn't have been able to colonize land or get nutrients from the land without fungi help. Okay? And we call these mycorrhizal fungi because they make relationships with the roots of plants, where they can sometimes live inside the plant cells or surround the outside of the plant cells, and then exchange nutrients, nitrogen, phosphorus, sulfur, things like that, in exchange for sugars that the plant produces through photosynthesis. And a lot of plant lineages today still have mycorrhizal fungi that associate with them. Most of them can't live, at least not very effectively, without mycorrhizal fungi. Okay, so plants, fungi, they're best buddies.